I'm Sarah Beck with Pacific Horticulture. I'm here at Filoli in Woodside, California, where staff are helping us to share questions from our gardening and allied professional audience on what they want to know about managing drought in the garden. Our expert panelists include climate-ready landscape plants researchers, extension specialists, nursery, and other horticulture field professionals.
What type of irrigation is best for native and drought-tolerant plant needs?
If you think about how rain happens, it comes from the sky, top down. If you think about sprinklers, they water from the side. They are not watering from the top down, and they are not putting water where the plants need it, which is on the soil where the roots are. And if you plant natives or non-natives with the sprinkler system, and all the plants go in this big, everything gets watered well for the first 6 months, year. But as they begin to grow, your plants block the sprinkler head. So eventually only the plants right around the sprinkler head are getting wet. Nothing else is getting irrigated. And along with that was this myth that drip was bad for plants, for native plants. I can show you 30-year-old gardens, mine included, with natives, with inline drip irrigation. What doesn't work very well is the old style of irrigation that's just a spot emitter here and there. That doesn't work very well for any in-ground plants. It doesn't matter native or not. But when you use inline drip and you're only getting water to the soil where the roots are, it's absolutely fine for natives.
The difference between drip versus overhead irrigation, which could appear to mimic natural rainfall because it's falling from the top, is that drip systems are typically 80% or 90% more efficient at delivering the water to where the plant needs it. So you're going to be putting your drippers below the plant canopy, typically, and it will be applying it to the root zone. Whereas overhead irrigation is spinning and shooting above the canopy. And so sometimes as low as 20%, but often 20 to 50% of the water doesn't actually make it to the plant's roots. It's into your pathways, it's into your driveway, it's just into areas beyond the root zone. So it's that application efficiency that goes way up with drip, meaning you're using less water typically. An overhead irrigation system does provide more cooling benefits to the overall landscape. So if you're looking at an extreme heat event, even in our production nurseries, sometimes they will bring out overhead irrigation to cool the leaves and cool the environment. So you would wash off and the dust can reduce transpiration. But if water conservation is your primary objective, then drip will win in almost every situation.
I think it's important to start out looking at, though, what type of plants you're growing. Because oftentimes in the landscape, we are growing, trees with shrubs, with perennials and annuals in a lot of cases. And I think that, understanding what the plant needs as far as water levels, also just from the beginning is important. Clearly, I think it's important to make sure that the root zone is saturated when you do irrigate. And, this is important, I think, for multiple reasons. I think, number one, you talk about, wanting to have drought tolerance and really strong plants. For sure, I think deeper rooted plants tend to be more robust and take stress generally better. I think it's also important to look at the irrigation delivery system, and that may even change at different stages of growth as far as your landscape or your garden.
Well, that's where that whole inline drip thing comes in, because when you create a grid over the surface, you're wetting the entire root zone evenly. And that, I wish we could get that concept across to more people. And once you explain it, it's like when it rains, what happens? All the soil gets wet exactly the same amount because it's coming from above and it's raining. What we're doing is we're actually emulating rain by using a grid of inline drip, because we're wetting the entire root zone evenly.
I absolutely agree with you that drip is getting a bad name. And I also think that part of that is that some of these decisions that drip is bad have come out of the same frustration that I share with you, where drip is misunderstood, misused, poorly designed, and badly managed. And it's not that hard. It's not that complicated, but we've got people still doing contracts for landscapes like mine, which is a suburban garden, it's got a whole mess of all kinds of things. And then they would still write a contractor might still write a contract saying X number of emitters per plant. I'm not going to do emitters per plant. I'm going to do a grid system, water the whole root zone, give everybody that benefit of a better root zone watering than just, I'm not going to irrigate this plant over here and this plant over here and then ignore the space between them. I think we have the ability to do irrigation through a drip system really well.
I think people need to step back. One of the reasons that they have grown natives is they think they will use less water. And if you are growing natives that are local to your region, they're evolved under the climate that you have, although our climate varies a lot and is probably shifting. Irrigation for natives is just to get them started and to make up for dry winters and maybe give them a little bit during the dry season so they look better rather than going dormant completely like they would in nature. So I think drip irrigation can do that because I use the dripper line and I tend to have a lot of, I do circles. So it's a round grid, but it's the same concept. You know, you have circles around plants and you can run it for a short time just to give it the amount of water it needs. And people underestimate how much water spray puts out. Even the really good quality rotating nozzles still put out a lot of water. Regular spray puts out almost as much as a shower. And this is a lot of water that the native plants may not even want. Some are very sensitive.
The point was made earlier that I think is the most important thing I've heard so far is that these drip systems can be excellent, but I see a lot of landscapes in my job, and it was mentioned, and I'll second it, that they are almost never installed properly and they're never used properly. And the third part that I'll add to that is that they're installed for whatever plant size you put in the ground. I don't care if it was a 4-inch pot or a 72-inch box, and then never changed for 25 years. And now you've got water too much going too close or not enough for the whole plant. And so just the ongoing maintenance and addition or subtraction from those systems is a huge part of it as well. And roots, a lot of these questions and answers, but more importantly, the questions are predicated on this theoretical model root system. And roots aren't uniform. Roots grow where there's moisture and oxygen. And so you can make roots go wherever you want. And when there's just little spot emitters, yeah, you've got a clump of roots right there. And the rest of what you might typically think of as the root zone has nothing. And that's another reason for this grid system. Now, I think with the inline drippers, the main issue, even if you built it properly, is people run them for 15 minutes and think they got the water down into the soil. And that's definitely not the case.
So hydrozoning, it's like when you want to be smart in your irrigation, it comes with the planning, right? So if you are building a new landscape, a valve should always be connected to a plant that requires same amount of water. So if you have a zone 1 and you have high water use plant, you better have all the high water use plant. If you have zone 2 and low water use plant, you better have all the low water use plant on that zone, because so when you put that information saying, like if you have, say, a high water use plant and a low water use plant in a same hydrozone, then in the system, you need to set up water for which plants. And usually you need to do it for high water use plant, otherwise it will die. And now you're wasting water. And also if native plants get too much water, they might die. So it's a very delicate balance. So it's better to do all this stuff when you plan the landscape.
The one principle that a lot of people get confused by is when they are changing how to irrigate, during the winter, the spring, summer, and fall, is people think they may want to put different amounts of water on. But it is very important to refill the soil profile with the same amount of water. Mm-hmm. The only thing that changes is the frequency. So in wintertime, for example, in our study, we actually irrigated, not at all in the low water, for the low water treatment, whereas for the high water treatment, we did irrigate twice and supplemented those winter rains. But then when it comes to the summertime, some of these plants, they get irrigated every 7 days, but the ones that are on the lowest irrigation regime, that might be your native plants, or it might be plants that are extremely drought tolerant, they may be irrigated twice during the warm summer. But you always put the same amount of water on there because you want to make sure that the plants, they have that water down to 1, 2, or 3 feet depth. And then when you have a hydrozone, let's say for the vegetable garden, people have vegetables. That is totally different because that needs to be watered a lot more often. And you go to maybe 12 to 18 inches, depending on what you're growing. But again, you want to fill it to that depth.
When somebody's asking what's wrong with their plant, and my first question is, how often are you watering? How long are you watering? And what technology are you using? And people will say, well, I'm using drip. I'm watering 15 minutes 3 times a week. No, that's not how you use drip. I mean, that you've got to be running it a long period of time. Have you ever stuck your finger in the soil to see how it feels? Stuck my finger in the soil? Why would I do that? Because you got to feel how deep the water has gone. Otherwise you're just guessing. Why did you set it up 15 minutes? Well, my landscaper set it up that way. Okay, well, your landscaper set it up that way as a kickoff. It's your responsibility to figure out how often and how long you need to run your drip irrigation system. And people don't have any sense of that. They figure the expert set it up, the expert must know what they're doing, and they go with that. So I think this is a big arena where we really need to be educating people on not just what the best technology is, but how to take responsibility for that technology and make sure it's working correctly to meet the needs of the plants.
That 15 minutes of watering, like you might wonder like what it does. So plants root, when we provide that 15 minutes of watering frequently, it only goes to that upper layer. So if there's a big wind, the root doesn't go down. They get lazy. I mean, they are getting enough water on the top layer and they are happy with that. So it just try to grow in the surface rather than going deeper. So if there's a wind or something and the plant's not well anchored, and it'll just topple down or it'll not grow well. So it's really crucial that we send the water deep inside the soil.
Many gardeners want to know how often to water. Questions included a variety of circumstances, such as differing soil types, climates with dry summers, and many plant species.
It depends.
What does it depend on?
Plants, soil, weather, climate, location, irrigation system, technology, irrigation management.
Shade.
Design.
Expectations.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, that's a huge one because there's a huge difference between how much water do I need to put down so this plant doesn't die versus how much do I need to put down for it to thrive. And, if you've got heavy water restrictions, maybe you're just trying not to let your landscape die. And if you have a couple good winters and all the reservoirs are full, now you can start to try and push some growth and get a bigger plant or a lusher garden. So yeah, the expectations is a huge one. And the other thing I'd say it depends on, and that was a great list that was given, is the history of irrigation on that site. Because even if someone's doing something clearly the wrong way, let's say watering for 15 minutes every day on a mature woody tree, and the right way to do it is different, you can't just stop and move to the better way. You have to wean it because those root systems have developed, acclimated to that water input. And if you all of a sudden start doing monthly deep soaks instead of daily nothing, basically, you're going to kill that tree or darn near close to it. Nothing you can do when you're changing water drastically can happen quickly. Everybody, homeowner wise, and everybody wants an answer to these questions that doesn't involve math or any numbers. You can't do it. You just can't do it. You need to understand that 1 inch of water soaks 8 inches of soil in a typical soil, and that's 623 gallons for 1,000 square feet. And if those are the only numbers anyone can remember, that's extremely useful numbers to keep in mind. And you can't do it without some math.
And you can't do it without knowing what kind of soil you have. There's no starting point without even knowing what kind of soil you have, or hydrozoning your plants so that at least the ones that want the same amount of water are planted together.
Yeah, I mean, the number of times I see ferns or azaleas or rhododendrons planted under coast live oaks, just, give me a dime for every time and I'm retired.
Yes.
Well, and a lot of people don't use a lot of the technology that's even available. I mean, just zoning out your landscape for the different needs of different plants. I mean, I have container gardens, right? I have shrubbery, I have, fence lines with trees, all on different zones, because guess what? They need different irrigation. They have different needs. That's another thing. We talk about saving water with a lot of these drought tolerant plants or natives. Well, this is one way to make sure that within your landscape, you're definitely only using what you really need.
I'm with Drew. Yeah, you've got to do the math. Yeah, and it's not hard. It's not hard. We just did this yesterday. I had this conversation yesterday with a master gardener about how to irrigate her trees, her fruit trees. And I said, the first question I asked was, what kind of soil do you have? And that's not a question that usually comes up in this conversation, because you have to know how much water the soil holds. And there's this really cool app that was developed by LAWR, the Land Air Water Resources Department at Davis, called Soil Web. And most phones have a GPS function, right? You open this app and it tells you your soil type, where you're standing. And I told her, I said, the parameter that I look at in the soil is on there. It says available water storage. And that's the plant available water that's in that soil down to a meter. That's usually something, a number like 15.78 centimeters. And so that's 15.78 centimeters of water in the top 100 centimeters of soil. So it's 15.78%. So I said, well, let's round it to 20 just to make the math easy. So if you assume that your roots are at 18 inches, so at 18 inches, 20% of 18 inches is 3.6. There's 3.6 inches of water available to the plant. You don't completely deplete all that water because you have dead plants. So the rule of thumb is you irrigate when half of it's depleted, 1.8 inches. So then you go to the CIMMYS website or some place that gives you ET information. In the valley, a typical summer day is 1/4 of an inch of ET per day. So 1/4 of an inch into 1.8 inches, that looks like about 7 days. 1, 2, 3, 4. Yeah, 7 days. So every 7 days, you put on 1.8 inches of water. You have to know the soil. You have to know the weather. You have to know the irrigation system. And it is really hard. There's no doubt about it. It's really complex.
One of the things I try to tell landscape maintenance professionals when I'm training for them is, Lauren's made the math, pretty straightforward there. And if you can find a presentation or a training and take it and follow along with it with your irrigation system, you really only have to do the math one time, right? For each system. So if you want to be that accurate, you follow those steps, you figure out what your soil is, you figure out how much water your drip system puts down, how much water your sprays put down. You do your calculations and you post it, you figure out your times and you post it inside of your irrigation controller. And most of the irrigation controllers now will either adjust for the weather or they will have a % adjustment that you can change. So if you figure it out for the hottest part of the year, then all you've got to do is go in and turn that one little adjustment to, say 45% in September and October and May and April, 60% for, June. And then, so you just have to do the calculations one time. But as far as the observationals, there's a lot of smart controllers out there, and every single one of them is different.
And there are some controllers that are not so smart.
And there's some that are not so smart, and there's some that are really hard.
Mhm.
And the fact is that a lot of our irrigation systems that have been installed by someone else, or just by non-professionals or professionals that didn't really know what they were doing, you have no idea how much water you're putting down in the drip system. And if there's not a gauge on it that's telling you how many gallons, and then there's another calculation for square footage and gallons to figure out how many inches.
There's also this thing called a smart controller. I hope you already know this and you have talked about it. But then these smart controller companies, they come with a software where it pulls up the weather station data, the evapotranspiration data, and adjusts the watering for you. Of course, it's not going to be perfect. You might need to tweak it a little bit depending on where you are and how far is the station. But then if you can customize it and program it properly, it's going to use less water, but then it's providing enough water for plants. So it's saving both ways.
And if you don't want to do math, another way that I teach is that usually you can find a historical ET for your area. Usually July is the highest water demand month of the year. And if you find that you're irrigating, let's say every 2 weeks, you're putting water on 3 times every 2 weeks in July. If you look at that ET map, usually March and October are 1/3 the amount of July. So 1/3 the amount means instead of 3 times every 2 weeks, 1 time every 2 weeks. And so somewhere in between there, in those months, you have to go to 2 times every 2 weeks. And then you're in the peak of the summer, you're at 3 times every 2 weeks. So just looking at that kind of number, ET number, and knowing where you're satisfied at the peak of the summer, it tells you how to adjust that to the lower demand months. Like we do for our experiments, don't touch the duration. You adjust when that water is applied. Once you figure out what the duration is to wet to the depth that wet the soil to the depth you want, don't touch that. You adjust when that water is applied.
I like to talk to people in terms of low water use or lower water use. I think a lot of times that's really what people are looking for as far as practical application. And so that's one of the things that I talk to people about, like, how much water do you think you want to use, right? Because there's a whole range of different landscaping that you can put in that has low or lower water use needs.